All right, I want to give you a few things to look for in chapter 4 of The Meaning of Jesus' Two Visions by Marcus Borg. Now, remember in this chapter, the essential question is the same as chapter 3. Basically, what did Jesus do and teach? But if you pay attention to the title of this chapter, he's already giving away a lot of his argument. So you already should know these terms, Jesus before and after Easter, and he's introducing two new terms, Jewish mystic and Christian Messiah. And so remember Borg's method. And here I've tried to kind of differentiate between the two Jesuses that he describes, the Jesus of history on the one hand, and the Jesus of faith on the other, or the Jesus of the developing tradition, the Jesus of experience over here. So he introduces these two new terms, Jewish mystic and then Christian Messiah. Now remember, so he's arguing here that Jesus, as a first century Jew, thought of himself as a Jewish mystic. Now, one of the things you need to pay attention to is how does he define that term? I'll give that away. A Jewish mystic was one for whom God was an experiential reality. In other words, Marcus Borg's arguing that Jesus actually experienced God. But did Jesus think of himself as the Messiah? So this is kind of the first question that he deals with on the first couple of pages of this chapter. And for Borg, pay attention to how he really describes that. The answer to that question, did Jesus think of himself as the Messiah, was no. Or at least he doesn't think so. Marcus Borg, I think, demonstrates a lot of really good intellectual humility by not coming out and saying, no, Jesus did not believe himself to be the Messiah. His argument is that we don't really have the historical evidence to come to like 100% confident belief that Jesus believed himself to be the Messiah. So he really says probably not. But for all intents and purposes, you could argue that Marcus Borg is saying that Jesus probably did not think of himself as the Messiah. But let me stop you here for a second. Marcus Borg thinks that Jesus was the Messiah. So don't misunderstand him there. Just because he doesn't think that Jesus thought of himself in those terms, for Borg does not mean that Jesus wasn't the Messiah. In other words, Borg argues that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. So who was Jesus? Pay attention to his the historical realities of Jesus on page 58 and 59. What we know about Jesus, what we know about carpenters, what social economic class were carpenters in, who was Jesus' mentor, how did Jesus' ministry start? Be sure you pay attention to that. And then I want you to think for just a second and pause the video if you need to. What must it have been like to live next to an enormous, vast amount of wealth when you were the victim of it? If you've seen any of the Hunger Game movies or read the books, just try to empathize for a second. What would it be like to live in District 12, where you are abused in many, many ways by the Capitol? I really think that that's a very strong analogy to what Marcus Borg is talking about on page 58 or 58 and 59, when we talk about Jesus being from a small town called Nazareth, next to a really big metropolis, Sepphoris. Sepphoris was a great Roman city with a ton of wealth. Jesus was probably familiar with that wealth. So these 5 things of a Jewish mystic, you need to understand all of them individually. So what does he mean by calling Jesus a Jewish mystic? He means all 5 of these things, that he was a spirit person, a healer, a wisdom teacher, a social prophet, and a movement initiator. Sometimes he uses spirit person and mystic interchangeably, because by these two he means that Jesus was one for whom God was an experiential reality. In other words, that Jesus experienced God. Be sure that you pay attention to what he means when he talks about Jesus as a healer. Let me just ask you a quick question. Does Borg think that Jesus actually healed people? Okay, does Borg think that Jesus actually healed people? Who was Jesus as a wisdom teacher? What type of wisdom teaching did Jesus teach? Conventional wisdom or alternative wisdom? Now, a social prophet, be sure that you're really, really clear, especially on page 71 here, because he introduces this phrase called the domination system. Again, think about Hunger Games if you need to, because Rome was a dominating system. He says on page 71, it was a politics of oppression, it was an economics of exploitation, and then the religion legitimated all that. And then finally, he was a movement initiator. In sense, because of all of these. So Jesus was a movement initiator because he was a social prophet, because he was a wisdom teacher, because he was a healer, and because he was a spirit person. Now he's pointing to the next chapter for him. Why did Jesus gain such a following? Well, it's because of all of this. But I want to draw your attention to this in particular. Jesus is a social prophet. Who would that challenge? As a first century Jew going against the Roman Empire, when he's challenging the oppression of Rome, Rome is gonna pay attention, and they're gonna do things to silence that voice. So at the very end, he talks about the difference between the pre-Easter and the post-Easter Jesus. He spends a lot of this chapter talking about the pre-Easter Jesus. But at the end, he tries to rework this argument in light of who Jesus became within the developing tradition. I hope that helps. Remember, for Marcus Borg, especially in this chapter, if you think about Jesus in light of the analogy of the Hunger Games, I think that you're going to have a much more clear and definitive idea of what Borg means when he talks about Jesus as the Jewish mystic and then also as the Christian Messiah.